Hi everybody, well today I'm re-reviewing the attention-grabbing Canon 17-55mm f2.8 IS USM lens. I first reviewed this lens about 3 years ago, but since then I've standardized and improved my testing procedure enough to make an update, especially as this lens is so popular and sought after. I've also had more time to use it and think about it, so I'll let you know my thoughts for what they're worth. This is an EF-S lens which will not work on Canon's expensive full-frame or 35mm film cameras. It's designed for Canon's APS-C sensor digital SLRs like the 7D, 60D, 700D, the Rebel series. But despite being designed for a smaller sensor, the lens is pretty big and heavy, especially compared to the tiny kit lens. The zoom range is almost the same, but the difference is that the f2.8 lens lets in a lot more light than the kit lens. It lets in nearly twice as much light at wide angle, and 4 times as much light when you zoom into 55mm, which is obviously a pretty big difference. f2.8 is a very nice aperture, letting in a decent amount of light and giving you a nicely blurred out background, a nice narrow depth of field, as you can see in this shot. You can get much faster maximum apertures than f2.8, but not often in a zoom lens, and so professional photographers and video makers covet this kind of lens enormously. Here's a demonstration. The 17-55mm f2.8 is on the left, and your typical kit lens is on the right. As you zoom in, the 17-55 doesn't lose any light at all, but the kit lens gets darker due to its cheap design. We see it getting lighter again as you zoom back out. You could try to counteract this by setting the kit lens to f5.6 as you zoom in, but you still get distracting changes in light levels as you can see here, and also because f5.6 is 4 times darker, I've had to set the ISO levels quite high, which reduces the picture quality. The constant aperture of the f2.8 lens looks much better than the variable aperture of the kit lens, which makes it very highly desirable for filmmakers and people who do low light photography. But you have to pay for it, as unsurprisingly this type of lens is expensive. So as you can see, it's pretty big, but the build quality is nice enough. As you've already seen, the zoom action is fairly smooth. The focus ring also turns very smoothly, and it turns just the right amount to not be too fiddly, which again is useful for filmmaking. The lens has full-time manual focusing, which means you can turn the focus ring even if it's set to autofocus. It's useful, but you expect to see this feature on such an expensive lens. The USM autofocus motor itself is super fast and almost silent, as you can hear here. The autofocus accuracy is pretty good, but it misses from time to time. Hopefully it was just me. A standout feature of this lens is image stabilization. In its time, it was revolutionary for an f2.8 zoom lens to have image stabilization, and it really is enormously helpful for your photography and filmmaking. It's a slightly older version of Canon's image stabilization though, which can occasionally be slightly jerky when you're filmmaking. It also makes slight clicking sounds while it runs, which could be picked up if you're recording sound. But overall, it's a great and very valuable feature. Well, enough about the build quality, let's look at the image quality. All these pictures were taken on an 18-megapixel Canon 60D. At 17mm with the aperture wide open at f2.8, we can see that the image is very sharp in the center of the picture, and the edges are softer, but nothing to complain about. Disappointingly, for a lens of this price, you can see some chromatic aberration in the edges of the windows. Stopping down to f4 yields a bit of an increase in sharpness, and the corners are very sharp at f5.6, although it's still not quite perfect, and the mild chromatic aberration remains. Of course, in the middle of the frame, the lens remains spectacularly sharp. Overall, a good but not perfect performance. Let's zoom in to 28mm. With the aperture wide open at f2.8, again the center of the image is fantastically sharp, and this time there's no slouching in the corners, where the image is also superb. There's simply no need to stop the aperture down at this point, but if you do, then the image quality remains fantastic. This is a perfect performance. Finally, let's zoom all the way in to 55mm. Wide open at f2.8, the lens is again perfect in the center of the image. If we look in the corners, then we see that, again, the sharpness is excellent, with only a tiny bit of chromatic aberration on contrasting edges. As we stop down to f4, the sharpness becomes even better and the chromatic aberration goes away completely. Stop down to f5.6 and the lens becomes razor sharp. And back in the center of the image, things remain perfect. So overall, this is clearly a very high performance camera lens, but considering it costs around £700 or $1,000, you might hope for slightly better performance at 17mm and a little less chromatic aberration. But that is nitpicking on a lens which is spectacularly sharp almost all the time. So let's look at some specific image quality issues. At f2.8, the lens suffers from moderate vignetting or darkness in the corners. If you use peripheral illumination on your camera, then it's dealt with quite nicely. At 17mm, this lens has only a moderate amount of barrel distortion. You can see here that straight lines are slightly bent, but actually it's much better than Canon's kit lens and other zoom lenses. This makes me very happy, and it's especially useful for filmmakers. I really like the lower distortion characteristic on this camera lens. It didn't show up on my sharpness tests, but at 17mm and f2.8, the lens does have some mild issues with purple fringing, as you can see here. The macro capability of this lens is not great. It can't get as close to your subjects as the kit lens does, but it gets close enough for shots of flowers and other things. The picture quality close up is not very good at f2.8, but it improves as you stop down to about f5.6. The lens's f2.8 maximum aperture means you can throw your background out of focus quite well. You get a nice narrow depth of field, which is useful for portrait photography, as you can see here. The actual quality of the out of focus backgrounds, or the bokeh, is a little controversial. Some people hate it, saying it's too busy and distracting, which it can be in certain situations. But overall, I think the bokeh is nice enough. The out of focus areas aren't super smooth, like on a Canon L lens or the Sigma 50mm 1.4, but they're good enough, and they certainly have a character of their own. I personally like the bokeh on this lens. I've used this lens in a lot of video work, and it's a joy to work with while you're filmmaking. I'll run some footage in the background for you now while I sum everything up. Firstly, there are a couple of rumours about this lens which I'd like to talk about. The first rumour is that as you zoom in and out, it sucks dust inside the lens and into the internal elements like some kind of image stabilised vacuum cleaner. Well, that never happened with my copy of the lens, and this copy has been used even more, and I can only see a couple of specks of dust inside. So in my experience, that's never really been an issue. The other rumour is that the image stabilisation tends to fail after a few years. A lot of people on the internet are reporting this problem, and unfortunately that's the case with this copy of the lens. The image stabilisation no longer works properly. Obviously it won't happen to all copies of this lens, but it seems to be a real issue, so you should probably get an extended warranty with this lens, especially if you're going to use it a lot. Nowadays there are other lenses like this one. Tamron have an image stabilised 17-50mm f2.8 lens, which is much less expensive, but it has comparatively poor build quality and picture quality at f2.8. But if you're just doing video work, it should be fine for the money you pay. Sigma also have an image stabilised 17-50mm f2.8 lens. It costs more than a Tamron lens, but less than this Canon one. Its picture quality is almost as good as the Canon lens, but the build quality isn't quite as nice, although it is smaller, which is a nice bonus. Basically, if you don't care about picture quality, get the Tamron 17-50mm f2.8 VC. If you want a lens that's good value and still gives good picture quality, get the Sigma 17-50mm f2.8 OS. If you want the very best and money is no object, then get this Canon 17-55mm f2.8 IS lens. It's not good value for money, but it is pretty much the best you can get, especially as a tool for filmmaking. And yet another alternative is the new Sigma 18-35mm f1.8 lens, which lets in over twice as much light and apparently has even better picture quality, but sacrifices zoom range and image stabilisation. and if ever I get my hands on one, a review for y'all will be coming straight up. But all in all, the Canon 17-55mm f2.8 IS/USM is a great lens, although not quite perfect. It's a real workhorse. If I could only have one lens in my kit bag, the amazing versatility of this lens means it would definitely be the one. And it's certainly one of the most versatile and fun filmmaking lenses out there. If you have the money for it, and enough room to actually accommodate it in your kit bag, then it comes very highly recommended.